Welcome to week 4 of International Trade Economics ECO335. During this week, we will cover chapter 4, which covers the specific factor model as well as income distribution. The Ricardian model of international trade we developed and analyzed in chapter 3 illustrated potential gains from trade with labor as a single factor of production. Although informative, the Ricardian model failed to highlight some effects of trade. For example, it assumes that every individual in a country gains from trade. However, in the real world, we observe unevenly distributed incomes. Specific factor model further adds to our knowledge of international trade by providing a better understanding of the distribution effects of trade. This model shows that with trade, exporting industries expand whilst importing industries contract. As a result, the factor specific to the exporting sector gains from trade whilst the factor specific to the importing sector lose out. The reverse is also true. However, the aggregate gains from trade are greater than the losses. Although the gains exceed the losses, there exists great opposition to free trade. In addressing why this is the case, this chapter will use the political economy of protectionism. Lastly, this chapter will focus on the distributional effects of international trade on labor migration. After studying this chapter, you should be able to understand how a mobile factor will respond to price changes by moving across sectors. Explain why trade will generate both winners and losers in the short run. Understand the meaning of gains from trade when there are losers. Discuss the reasons why trade is a politically contentious issue. Explain the arguments in favor of free trade despite the existence of losers. Our discussion of the specific factor model will be structured as follows. Firstly, we will discuss specific factor model, followed by the analysis of trade using the specific factor model. Then thereafter, we will analyze the income distribution and gains from trade given the outcome of international trade. We will also discuss the political economy of trade, followed by the effects of international labor mobility. The Ricardian model of international trade outlined the benefits from specialization when trading countries' labor is shifted from relatively inefficient industries towards industries that are relatively efficient. Using labor as the only mobile factor of production between industries, the Ricardian model further suggests that trade benefits every individual. However, this is not what happens in the real world as we observe uneven distribution of income. There are two main reasons why international trade has strong effects on the distribution of income, and these are resources cannot move immediately or costlessly from one industry to the other, and industries differ in the factors of production they demand. Therefore, a change in the goods produced in the country causes a fall in demand for some factors whilst increasing the demand for other factors. This implies that while trade is beneficial to a nation, it often hurts some groups of people in the short run and potentially, but to a lesser extent, in the long run. Hence, a realistic model of trade must go further beyond the Ricardian model by analyzing other important elements of international trade. The specific factor models goes a step further from the Ricardian model by allowing another factor of production in the analysis of international trade. This addition offers us a way to analyze the effects of income distribution when an economy is open to trade. Before we start discussing the specific factor model, let us start by outlining the assumptions of the model, which are we have two goods in our analysis, which is cloth and food. There are three factors of production, which is labor, capital, and land, and perfect competition prevails in all the markets. Cloth is produced using capital and labor, but not land. And food is produced using land and labor, but not capital. Labor is the only mobile factor between the two sectors. Land and capital are both specific factors used only in the production of one or a particular good. Based on these assumptions, The economy's production of a good largely depends on the capital and labor that is used in that sector. This relationship is outlined by a production function which shows the quantity of a good that can be produced given any input of capital and labor. For example, the production function of clothes shows the quantity of clothes that can be produced given a combination of capital and labor. This can be illustrated algebraically as total cloth output is a function of capital stock and labor, where QC is the total quantity of cloth, K is the capital stock, and LC is the labor employed in the production of cloth. Alternatively, the production function for food shows the quantity of food that can be produced given any input of labor and land. This production function is summarized algebraically as total food output is a function of total supply of land and labor employed in the food production, where QF is the total food output, T represents the total supply of land, and LF is the total labor employed in the food sector. The total labor employed in both the cloth and food sector in the whole economy must be equal to the total labor supply. Algebraically, this is shown by the equation LC plus LF is equal to L. Recall that the specific factor model assumes that specific factors, that is capital and land, are only used in one sector, with only labor being mobile between the sectors. Therefore, to analyze the economy's production possibilities, we need to be able to discuss what happens when the economy mix of output changes as a result of labor moving from one sector to the other. This is achieved graphically by deriving the production possibility frontier based on the production function of cloth and food as well as the total labor supply. Let us start by looking at the production function of cloth, which is illustrated in figure 4.1. This figure shows that the more labor employed in the production of cloth for a given supply of capital, the larger the output. The shape of the production function reflects the law of diminishing marginal returns. This means by adding one worker in the production of cloth without increasing the amount of capital, each worker has less capital to work with. Therefore, each additional unit of labor adds less output than the last. Figure 4.2 illustrates the same information as was in the production function of cloth. However, it shows the information with regards to the marginal product of labor, which is the slope of the production function curve. The marginal product of labor refers to the additions to output generated by adding one more person hour in the production process. The shape of the marginal product curve illustrates that the higher the marginal product of labor, the fewer the labor employed in that specific sector. Thus, it is downward sloping. The way we have illustrated the production function of cloth and the marginal product of cloth graphically, the same can be done for food production function and the marginal product curve for food. Now, let us use the cloth and food production function together with the total supply of labor in the economy to construct a production possibility frontier for the whole economy. Figure 4.3 is a four-quadrant diagram. The lower left quadrant indicates the allocation of labor. Both quantities are measured in the reverse of the usual direction. That is, a downward movement along the vertical axis indicates an increase in the labor employed in the cloth sector, whereas a leftward movement along the horizontal axis indicates an increase in employment employed in the food sector. Therefore, with full employment of all the available labor, an increase in employment in one sector implies a decrease in labor in the other sector. Thus, the labor allocation curve slopes downwards at a 45-degree angle. The lower right quadrant shows production function for cloth as illustrated in figure 4.1. However, the figure had been turned on its side. A movement downwards along the vertical axis shows an increase in labor input in the cloth sector, whereas a rightward movement on the horizontal axis shows an increase in the output of cloth. The upper left quadrant shows the production function for food. Just like what we did with figure 4.1, this figure is also flipped around so that a movement on the left along the horizontal axis indicates an increase in labor input to the food sector, whilst an upward movement along the vertical axis indicates an increase in food output. Lastly, the upper right quadrant indicates the combination of cloth and food that can be produced in the whole economy given the available supplies of land, labor, and capital. The curvature of the production possibility curve reflects diminishing returns to labor. Also note that this curve is traced out by varying the amount of labor, capital, and land used in the production of both cloth and food. The shape of the production possibility frontier illustrates one of the important differences between the specific factor model and the Ricardian model, where constant opportunity cost exists. The increasing opportunity cost illustrated by the specific factor model arise due to the diminishing returns to labor in each sector that cause the opportunity cost to rise when the economy produces more of a good. Thus, for example, the slope of the PPF becomes steeper as the economy produces more cloth. To illustrate why the production possibility frontier reflects increasing opportunity cost, let us start by 1% hour of labor from food production towards cloth production. This extra input in the cloth sector would increase output by the marginal product of labor in cloth. That is, to produce one more yard of cloth, we will need 1 over the marginal product of cloth hours of labor. The moved labor hours result in less employment in the food sector as well as less output of food by the marginal product of labor in the food sector. Thus, the marginal product of labor in food rises whilst the marginal product of labor in cloth falls. So the slope of the production possibilities curve or the PPF rises. Therefore, as more and more labor is moved towards the cloth industry, the additional unit of labor becomes less valuable in the cloth sector and more valuable in the food sector. Hence, the PPF becomes steeper as we move down it to the right. In general, we observe that as more labor is moved from one sector, the production output of that sector falls whilst the production of the other sector rises. Up to now, we have illustrated how output is determined given labor, land, and capital in the economy. Now, let us move a step further by examining how the efficient allocation of labor in the economy is determined using demand and supply in the labor market. Please note that the demand for labor in each sector depends on the price of output and the wage rate, whereas the wage rate depends on the combined demand for labor in both sectors. Therefore, given the price of cloth and food as well as the wage rate, we can determine the optimal employment and output in each sector. To illustrate how the optimal employment and output are determined, let us start by looking at the demand for labor. The demand for labor in each sector will be up to the point where the value produced by an additional hour of labor equal the marginal cost of employing a worker for that hour, given that employers are profit maximizers. In the cloth sector, the value produced by an additional hour of labor is the marginal product of labor in cloth multiplied by the price of 1 unit of cloth, which should be equal to the marginal cost or the wage rate paid by employers for that additional hour. Similarly, in the food sector, The demand for food is reflected by the value of the additional person hour in food, which is also equal to the marginal cost of labor. Recall from the marginal cost of labor in cloth and food we illustrated in figure 4.2 that the marginal product of labor curve was a downward sloping curve, and if we multiply it by the price of the good, then we will still have a downward sloping curve. This curve reflects the negative relationship between the wage rate and labor, ceteris paribus. Therefore, we can express this downward sloping curve as the demand curve for labor in that specific sector. The wage rate in both cloth and food sectors must be the same because labor is freely mobile between sectors. This simply means if the wage rate is higher in one sector, workers will move towards that sector as they maximize their earnings. However, this movement of workers will drive the wages down until the wage is the same. The equilibrium wage is determined by the intersection of the labor demand for both cloth and food. Furthermore, the intersection of the demand curve also reflects labor allocation in both these sectors. Figure 4.4 represents the labor demand curve for cloth and food. The demand curve for labor in the cloth sector is denoted PC times MPLC. Note that this curve is identical to the marginal product curve in 4.2. The demand curve for labor in the food sector is denoted PF star multiplied by PFLF, MPLF, right? Is derived from the same way as that for cloth. However, it had been flipped around so that its values are measured from the right. The horizontal axis of figure 4.4 shows the total supply of labor employed in both sectors. In equilibrium, the marginal cost of labor is the wage rate is equal to W1, which is equal to the value of labor marginal product in both sectors. Also, at equilibrium, the total labor employed in cloth and food sectors equal to the total supply of labor in the economy. From the figure 4.4, we notice that there is a useful relationship between prices and output resulting from the analysis of labor allocation, which also implies to a more general allocation situation. That is, at a production point, the slope of the production possibility frontier is tangent to the slope of a line whose slope is the price of cloth divided by the price of food. This outcome is obtained by first equating the demand curve for cloth with that for food and then rearrange the term to obtain the relationship. Figure 4.5 shows the equilibrium production point in the economy as reflected at point 1. At point 1, the negative slope of the PPC equals the negative relative price of cloth in terms of food. Also, at this point, a total of QC output of cloth is produced together with the total of QF output of food in the economy. Given the equilibrium production point, let us now examine what happened when there is a change in the price of cloth and food to the allocation of labor and income distribution. The changes in the price of cloth and food can be broken down into two parts, namely an equal proportional change in both prices and a change in only price of one good, or what we call a change in relative prices. When both prices of cloth and food changes with the same proportion, say 10% increase, there will be no real change that will occur simply because as the wage rate rises in the same proportion as the prices, then the real wage remains the same or unaffected. As a result, the income of capital owners and land owners also remain the same. Thus, everyone is in exactly the same position as before the price change. This outcome reflects a general principle that changes in the overall price levels have no real effect or do not change any physical quantities in the economy. Figure 4.6 illustrates an equal proportional increase in the price of both cloth and food. Suppose our initial equilibrium is at point 1 with the wage rate equal to W1. If the price of both cloth and food increase at the same proportion, then the demand curve for cloth and food both increase or shift upwards. After the increase, a new equilibrium is established at point 2 with a new wage rate of W2. Since the rise in prices is equivalent to the rise in wages, the real wage remains the same. Therefore, at point 2, the allocation of labor between the two sectors remains same. When the price of one product changes, say the price of cloth increased by 7%, then the demand curve for cloth will increase with the same proportion as the price increase, whilst the demand curve for food remains unchanged. There are two important outcomes of this change in the price of one good, namely, the wage will rise but by less than the increase in price because the rise in cloth employment lowers the marginal product of labor in the cloth sector. Second, labor shift from the food sector towards the cloth sector and the cloth output rises whilst food output falls. Figure 4.7 illustrates the effects of a change in one good price. That is, as the price of cloth increased by 7%, the demand curve for labor in cloth sector shifts outwards, and the equilibrium wage increased from W1 to W2. At W2, we can observe that the increase in the wage rate is less than the increase in the price of the cloth. Also, we also observe that the allocation of labor changes as labor moves from the food sector to the cloth sector. The effect of a change in the price of cloth can also be seen directly on the production possibility curve. That is, starting from point 1, an increase in the price of cloth causes the relative price of cloth to rise to P2 slash PF, which is the U slope of that second curve, and the new equilibrium point will now be at point 2. At point 2, we also observe that the output of cloth rises whilst that of food falls. As the higher relative price of cloth leads to a higher output of cloth relative to that of food, we can draw a relative supply curve illustrating the relative quantity of cloth as a function of the relative price of cloth. Thus, the relative supply curve is upward sloping. We can also draw a relative demand curve which is shown in figure 4.9 by a downward sloping curve. Therefore, in the absence of trade, equilibrium, relative price and output are determined by the intersection of the relative supply and relative demand curves. Now let us examine the effects of one product price change on the distribution of income. Recall that when the price of cloth increased by 10%, the demand curve for cloth will shift outward by 10%. However, the change in the wage rate will be less than 10%. Also, there will be an increase in the production of cloth and a decrease in the production of food. Given these outcomes, let us focus on the economic effects of the price change on the income of three groups of people, namely workers, owners of capital, and owners of land. Owners of capital are definitely better off since the real wage in terms of cloth falls, the profit of capital owners in terms of cloth rises. Owners of land are definitely worse off because firstly, the real wage in terms of food rises, reducing their income, and secondly, the rise in cloth reduces the purchasing power of any other good. In terms of workers, we found out that the real wage has increased but less than the rise in price. Thus, the real wage in terms of cloth falls, whilst their real wage in terms of food rises. Hence, we cannot say whether they are better off or they are worse off, since that depends on the workers' relative importance of cloth and food in consumption. Now let us link the relative price change to international trade and examine the prediction of winners and losers. In autarky, the relative price of cloth is determined by the intersection of the economy's relative supply and demand of cloth. However, with free trade, the price of cloth is determined by the intersection of world relative supply of cloth and the world relative demand, thus opening up trade increases the relative price of cloth in an economy whose supply of cloth is larger than for the world as a whole, as illustrated in Figure 410. Figure 410 shows the relative supply curve for the economy along with the world relative supply curve. When the economy is open to trade, the relative price of cloth is determined by the relative supply and demand for the world as depicted at point 2. This differs due to technological differences to the relative price of a country in autarky. Figure 410 shows that with trade, the relative price of clothes increases, causing the economy to produce more clothes. Consumers will respond to the higher relative price of clothes by demanding more food. Therefore, with the trade at a higher relative price of cloth, the economy will export cloth and import food. Let us now analyze who gains or loses from trade given that international trade exists. Recall from the previous discussion that international trade raises the relative price of traded goods. This implies that the specific factor in the sector whose relative price will gain, whilst the specific factor in the other sector will lose. As a result, in our analysis, we observe that the export sector gains at the expense of the import sector. However, could there be a possibility that those who gain from trade compensate those who lose out and still be better off? If that possibility exists, then trade will be beneficial to everyone. The analysis of production and consumption shown shows that there exist aggregate gains from trade. Let us see how. Without trade, the economy's output of a good must be equal to its consumption. If we denote DC as consumption for cloth and DF as consumption for food, then in autarky or closed economy, production is equal to consumption for both cloth and. However, with trade, it is possible for the mix of cloth and food to differ from this mix produced. Nevertheless, with trade, a country cannot spend more than it earns, as shown by the equation below, which simply shows the value of consumption must be equal to the value of production. If we rearrange the equation for an open economy, production equals consumption, we will be able to show that the value of import of food equal to the relative price of cloth multiplied by the value of cloth exported as expressed by the equation. This equation tells us that the value of food the economy can afford to import is limited or constrained by the value of its exports. Thus, this equation is also known as the budget constraint. Figure 411 illustrates two important features of the budget constraint for trading, namely that, firstly, the slope of the budget constraint is equal to minus the relative price of cloth, simply showing that one unit of cloth can be exchanged on the world market for a unit of food. Secondly, the budget constraint is tangent to the production possibility curve, shows that the economy can still afford to consume what it produces. Therefore, point 2 shows the economy's production point. The economy can choose its consumption point along its budget constraint. Before the trade, the economy consumes what it can produce, such as at point 1. The portion of the budget constraint in the colored region consists of feasible post-trade consumption choices where consumption of both goods are higher than the pre-trade output. The result depicted in figure 411 shows that there are aggregate gains from trade throughout an expansion of choices. As a result of the expansion of choices, it is possible to redistribute income so that everyone gains from trade. That is, those who gain will compensate those who lose out in such a way that the gainers will still be better off. The notion that everyone could gain from trade does not mean that everyone gains in practice. As in the real world, redistribution of goods to losers is hard to implement, if not impossible. Therefore, the presence of winners and losers in trade is one of the most important reasons why international trade is not free. Trade often produces losers and winners. The insights, this insight is important in the analysis of trade policy in the modern world economy. From our analysis of trade based on the specific factor model, we have determined that losers in trade are mostly owners of capital as well as the labor force in the import competing sector of the economy. Hence, the optimal trade policy must weigh one group's gain against another's losses. Nevertheless, some groups may need special treatment because they are already relatively poor. For example, workers in the apparel sector in the United States that earn in 2009 36% below the average wage across all manufacturing sectors. Despite the losses in trade, most economists generally favor free trade. There are three reasons why economists generally do not stress the income distribution effects of trade. Namely, income distribution effects are not specific to trade. 1. 2. Those who stand to lose from increased trade are typically better organized than those who stand to gain. See the discussion of sugar industry in the United States. 3. The government usually provides a safety net of income support to cushion the losses the groups had by trade. See the case of trade and unemployment. The movement in the factors of production include labor migration, transfer of financial assets, international borrowing and lending, as well as the transaction of multinational corporations involving direct ownership of foreign firms. The analysis of physical capital is more complex, hence for this course we will only focus on the analysis of labor in the modern world. There is a great deal of movement of labor around the world. As a result, most governments impose restrictions on the flow of labor. It is important to understand the economic force that drives the aggression of workers across borders, as well as its effect. In the previous section, we discussed how workers move freely from one sector to the other until wages in both sectors are equalized. This outcome is the same for international migration as workers move from low-wage countries towards higher-wage countries. To analyze the effects of migration, let us assume that there are two countries which produce only one good, food, with labor that is mobile and land that is immobile. Since there is only one good, we observe trade in labor services more across the countries. Figure 430 illustrates the equilibrium wage and labor allocation with migration across countries. Note that this figure is similar to figure 4.4. However, they differ in that the marginal product of labor is not multiplied by the price of the good, and the horizontal axis shows the total world labor supply, not just the country's labor supply. Also, this figure assumes that the real wages are measured on the vertical axis, starting from OL1 workers in the home country and lower wages, that is point C, than workers in foreign country, point B. Faced with such differential, workers in the home country be willing to migrate to a foreign country. Now suppose there is no obstacle to the movement of labor. Workers in the home country will move to the foreign country until the purchasing power is equal between the two countries at point A, with all L2 workers in the home country and O star L2 workers in the foreign country. The emigration from home leads to a decrease in the supply of labor and raises the real wage for the workers left at home, whilst immigration into the foreign country increases the supply of labor and decreases the real wage. Figure 413 shows the effects of international mobility between the home and foreign nations. The initial employment level in the home country is OL1, with the earnings of a real wage equal to point C, whereas employment in foreign country is equal to OL1 with a higher real wage equal to point B. Therefore, workers will move from home to the foreign country until the real wage equalizes countries, which is now at point A. It just means at point A, the real wage between countries have equalized. At point A in the figure, it is important to note the following. 1. There is convergence in real wage between countries. Workers initially in home benefit while workers in foreign are hurt by the inflow of workers. 3. Landowners in the home country are hurt by the outflow of workers as there will be an increase in wage whilst output is falling. 4. Landowners in the foreign country gain from the inflow of workers as they experience a decrease in the real wage and an increase in output. Therefore, the mobility of labor, although it gains other people, it tends to hurt other people.